They were told the Americans would strip them naked, mock their bodies, leave them bleeding and humiliated before they died in shame. That was the story that had been whispered through bombed-out basements and air raid shelters during the final, hopeless months of the war. That was what every German woman had been taught to expect when captured by the enemy. But when 247 female prisoners stepped off the transport trucks at Camp Ruston, Louisiana, in the summer of 1945, something entirely different happened. The enemy didn't break them with cruelty. They broke them with kindness. Imagine that moment. The air in Louisiana was heavy and wet, thick with the smell of pine and red dust. The women, nurses, radio operators, clerks, and signal spotters were exhausted. They'd crossed an ocean in the belly of a dark ship, then rattled across a strange continent inside train cars that never seemed to stop. When the trucks finally halted and the canvas flaps were pulled aside, sunlight stabbed their eyes. They expected barbed wire, barking guards, and dogs straining on chains. Instead, they saw painted buildings, swept pathways, and flags moving gently in the breeze. To them, it made no sense. How could this be the enemy's camp? This is not a story about battles or generals or borders being redrawn on a map. It's a story about what happens after the fighting stops, when soldiers put down their rifles and something deeper begins to fight inside them. It's about one woman named Greta, a nurse from Hamburg, who learned that sometimes the hardest thing to survive isn't cruelty, but compassion. Because kindness, when you least expect it, forces you to confront everything you believe about who is good and who is evil. In the years after the war, historians would debate numbers and strategies. But behind all of that were quiet human moments, unrecorded acts of mercy that reshaped the people who experienced them. This story, long buried in a forgotten American camp, is one of those moments. It reminds us that even in the ruins of war, humanity can still whisper through the cracks. At Camp Ruston, the war was technically over. Germany had surrendered. But inside the minds of these women, the war raged on. They still carried the propaganda of the Reich, those invisible chains of fear and pride. They believed the Americans would treat them as monsters because that's what they'd been told Americans were. They believed their captors would be brutal because that's what they'd been trained to expect. And so, when the trucks stopped that June morning, their hearts were pounding, their throats dry with dread. But instead of shouting, they heard calm voices. Instead of whips or fists, they saw clipboards and paperwork. Instead of hatred, they met indifference, tired young men who simply wanted to go home. It wasn't mercy, not yet. It was something quieter, something that would grow, day by day, into the most disarming weapon these women had ever faced. This documentary isn't just about a camp in Louisiana. It's about what happens when an entire generation, on both sides, starts to see the humanity of their enemy. It's about the strange power of dignity, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't threaten, but simply treats another person as human. And for Greta, that simple act would change everything she thought she knew about her country, her captors, and herself. As the trucks rolled to a stop that morning, she pressed her small bag against her chest. A few photographs, a letter, a small wooden cross. Everything she had left of the world before. She whispered a prayer she no longer fully believed in. Outside, the guards were waiting. Their rifles slung low, not raised. Their faces unreadable under the southern sun. "Move along, ladies, single file. Keep your belongings with you." The English words sounded strange, soft in tone but firm in rhythm. And as Greta climbed down from the truck, her boots crunching against the gravel, she smelled something she hadn't smelled in years. It wasn't sweat or smoke or fear. It was food. Fried chicken, fresh bread, coffee. The scent drifted from somewhere nearby, and for a moment, confusion pierced through her fear. Was this some kind of trick? She turned to the woman beside her, another prisoner with hollow eyes. "Why does it smell like someone's kitchen?" she whispered in German. The other woman didn't answer. She couldn't. Because in that instant, none of them could make sense of it. The world they had known, of hate, of division, of absolute certainty, was beginning to crack. And that's where our story begins. In a place of heat and dust and silence. In a moment where fear met something it didn't know how to fight. They had prepared for cruelty, but cruelty never came. What came instead was kindness. And for Greta and for the hundreds of women beside her, that would become the hardest battle of all. The truck engines finally went quiet. The dust hung in the air like smoke after a long fire. Greta could feel her heart thudding in her throat as the line began to move. The Americans were calling names, taking notes, weaving them forward. And as she stepped toward the gates of Camp Ruston for the first time, fear, confusion, and disbelief walked beside her. The truck engines fell silent. Dust hung in the morning air like smoke after a fire, coating everything in a faint red haze. The women sat frozen for a long moment, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Greta clutched her small bag to her chest, a letter, a photograph, a wooden cross carved by her father, and whispered the same prayer she had whispered every day since capture. Please God, let it be quick. Outside, American voices barked orders, but not with anger. The tone was firm, clipped, almost mechanical. Move along, ladies, single file, keep your belongings with you. Greta glanced at the guard nearest her. He was young, barely older than the wounded boys she treated in field hospitals. His uniform was wrinkled, his hair damp with sweat. He didn't sneer. He didn't even look at her for long. He just waved her forward like someone who'd been awake too many nights. That, somehow, was more unsettling than cruelty. They stepped out into the heat. The air felt thick, heavy with humidity, alive with the buzz of cicadas. A line of guard towers framed the horizon, their shadows cutting across the gravel yard. Between the fences, American flags flapped lazily, flashes of red, white, and blue against the blinding summer sky. Greta's heart pounded. She had seen barbed wire before, around labor camps, prison trains, ruins, but this wire looked clean, organized. The paths were swept, the buildings painted pale yellow and white. Even the grass between the barracks was trimmed short. Everything was wrong. She expected chaos, filth, shouts, the harsh stink of fear. Instead, there was order. Too much order. It felt like stepping into a lie she couldn't yet understand. The column of women moved slowly across the yard toward a long, low building with open doors and a shaded porch. Inside, they could see rows of tables and men with clipboards. Greta's mouth was dry, her uniform stiff with sweat and dirt. She hadn't washed properly in weeks. Behind her, someone whispered in German, "They're going to separate us." Another replied, "They'll strip us. That's what they do." The murmurs rippled down the line like static electricity. Small, nervous, impossible to stop. But the guards didn't respond. They didn't threaten, didn't laugh, didn't even glance at the women. They just did their jobs. That calm professionalism frightened Greta more than she wanted to admit. When her turn came, she stepped into the processing room. The air was cooler inside, stirred by large metal fans that hummed in the corners. Papers rustled, pens scratched across forms. A soldier sitting behind a table looked up. "Name," he asked. Greta hesitated. The word caught in her throat. He waited, patient, pencil poised above the page. "Greta Mueller," she finally said. He wrote carefully, his handwriting neat, almost delicate. Then he asked her age, hometown, occupation. Each answer felt like peeling off another layer of herself. He didn't scowl or mock her accent. He just nodded, stamped the paper, and motioned her to the next table. It was terrifying how ordinary it all felt. At the next station, another soldier took her small bag and began listing the contents. He removed the photo of her sister, the wooden cross, the folded letter. Each item was cataloged, wrapped, and placed into a box marked with her name. "Don't worry," the interpreter said in halting German. "You get back later." Greta nodded, though she didn't believe him. In war, later never came. But here, even that small promise, spoken without cruelty, felt strange. Then came the medical examination. The women were led into another room where two female nurses waited. The sight of them, Americans in crisp white uniforms, made Greta's stomach twist. This was it, the humiliation they had feared most. But instead of shouting, the nurses smiled. Not the smirk of a victor, but the polite smile of a professional doing her job. "Hello," one of them said, in slow, broken German. "We check health. You sit, please." Greta sat, hands trembling. The nurse checked her pulse, her eyes, her weight. Her touch was gentle, clinical, but not cold. "You are okay," the nurse said, jotting something on a clipboard. "A little thin, but okay. We feed you good here." That sentence lingered like a ghost in Greta's mind. "We feed you good here?" She almost laughed. She wanted to scream. Feed the enemy? It made no sense. After the examination, they were handed small cards with medical notes and directed toward the showers. The moment they saw the tiled room, dread rippled through the group. This was it. This was where it would happen. Every story they'd heard came rushing back, the stripping, the taunts, the cruelty. But instead, there were partitions, curtains, privacy. No one watched. No one touched them. They were handed clean towels, bars of white soap that smelled faintly of lavender, and told simply, "Wash." Hot water poured from the pipes, real hot water. Greta stood under the stream, frozen at first. Then she pressed her hands to her face and let the dirt and fear wash away. For the first time in months, she felt human. And that realization terrified her more than anything else. When she stepped out, another guard handed her clean work clothes, plain cotton, slightly worn but freshly laundered. Not the rough gray prisoner uniforms she'd imagined, but simple shirts and trousers, like something you might wear in a field or a kitchen. There were no numbers, no armbands, just clothes. Greta looked at herself in a small mirror nailed to the wall. Her skin was pale but clean, her hair damp, clinging to her forehead. She barely recognized the reflection staring back. For a brief second, she didn't look like a prisoner at all. Outside, the women gathered in small groups, whispering to each other, their voices low and uneasy. "Maybe they're trying to trick us," one said. "They'll make us feel safe first." Another shook her head. "No, this is too much work for a trick." Greta didn't know what to think. Her mind swirled with contradictions. The things she'd seen in the last few hours didn't fit the world she thought she knew. She remembered the camps back home, the hunger, the cold, the cruelty, and yet here she was, on enemy soil, feeling cleaner, safer, and more respected than she had in years. It didn't feel like mercy. It felt like an experiment, and she wasn't sure who was being tested, them or their captors. As dusk approached, the guards led them toward a large wooden building at the center of the camp. Smoke rose gently from its chimney. The smell that had teased them earlier was stronger now. Fried chicken, baked bread, coffee. Greta's stomach clenched. She hadn't eaten properly in days. Inside the mess hall, long wooden tables stretched from end to end. American cooks in white aprons moved behind the counter, ladling food onto metal trays. The women filed in silently, eyes darting around the room like trapped birds. When Greta reached the counter, a man handed her a tray with mashed potatoes, green beans, a piece of fried chicken, and a small roll with a pat of butter. The food was steaming, real food. She stood there staring. The woman behind her nudged her forward. Greta stumbled toward an empty seat. For a long moment, no one ate. They just stared at the plates in front of them. Then, slowly, Greta lifted her fork. She took one bite. It was warm, soft, salty. She had to cover her mouth to stop herself from sobbing. Around her, other women began to eat in silence. Some cried openly, some trembled so hard they could barely hold their utensils. A young woman whispered, "My mother is eating bark soup at home, and I have butter." Greta couldn't reply. The guilt was too heavy. When they finished, each woman was handed a small brown bar wrapped in silver paper, Hershey's chocolate. Greta turned it over in her hand, disbelieving. She hadn't seen chocolate since before the war. That night, as she lay in the barracks on a clean mattress with a wool blanket, she broke off a tiny piece and let it melt on her tongue. The sweetness was almost painful. She closed her eyes and thought of her sister back in Hamburg, hungry and scared. Tears slid down her cheeks. "We are the enemy," she whispered to the dark. "Why do they treat us this way?" No one answered. Only the cicadas outside, humming endlessly in the warm Louisiana night. Morning would come soon. The sun would rise over the pine trees, and the camp would wake to another strange day of order and quiet routine. But that night, lying clean, fed, and bewildered, Greta realized that something inside her had shifted. She no longer feared the Americans the way she once had. Instead, she feared what their kindness was doing to her. Night fell softly over Camp Ruston. The air was still thick with heat, but a breeze carried through the pine trees, whispering against the canvas walls of the barracks. Somewhere, far off, a dog barked. The war was thousands of miles away, but for the women lying in those bunks, its shadow still clung to their bones. Greta lay on her side, eyes open in the darkness. The barracks smelled faintly of soap and wood polish, scents she hadn't known since childhood. Every creak of the bedboards, every sigh in the room reminded her she was still alive, still captive, still unsure what tomorrow would bring. Around her, the others were quiet, each lost in her own tangle of thoughts. Some prayed under their breath. Some cried softly, too tired to hide it. Others stared up at the rafters, waiting for the nightmare they had expected all day to finally begin. But it never came. For Greta, that was the strangest thing. No guards barged in, no orders shouted in the dark, no punishments. Just silence and the hum of night insects beyond the open windows. Her stomach was full, her skin was clean, and yet she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the food, about the soap, about the nurse's gentle voice. Every act of kindness pressed against her like a bruise she couldn't ignore. She had seen cruelty. She knew how to hate cruelty. But this quiet decency, she didn't know how to defend against it. It made her feel guilty. Guilty for surviving, guilty for being cared for, guilty that the hands that had fed her were supposed to be her enemies. Sometime after midnight, she turned her head and whispered to the woman in the next bunk. "Do you think they're doing this to make us talk?" The woman hesitated before answering. "Maybe, or maybe they just want to prove they're better than us." Greta didn't reply. The idea twisted in her chest. If kindness was a strategy, it was an effective one. Because even as she lay there, she could feel her certainty crumbling. Everything the Reich had told her, the propaganda, the slogans, the fiery speeches about honor and loyalty, felt suddenly small and brittle compared to a simple bowl of warm food. It was as if her captors had found a weapon sharper than bullets: dignity. In the early hours of the morning, when the first light crept through the cracks in the wall, Greta sat up. The camp was still quiet. A few women were awake, staring into nothing. On the small table near the door, someone had placed a metal bucket filled with water and a few cups. A note, written in uneven German, read, "Drink if you need, sleep well." She stared at it for a long time. The handwriting was awkward but careful. Someone had taken the time to write in their language. That, more than anything else, broke her composure. She felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. Don't give them that satisfaction, she told herself. But a part of her whispered, they're not asking for satisfaction. When dawn finally broke, the camp stirred to life. The sound of footsteps on gravel, the metallic clang of pots in the distance, a bugle call, faint and far away. Greta rose with the others, folding her blanket neatly as if by instinct. They lined up outside, bleary-eyed, waiting for roll call. The American guards stood nearby, calm, efficient, even bored. One of them yawned. Another lit a cigarette and offered one to his comrade. Not one of them raised their voice. The officer in charge, a man with gray at his temples, checked the list. He spoke through an interpreter. "You will have breakfast in 10 minutes, then medical check, then assignment." Assignment? The word buzzed through the line like static. Work? Punishment? No one knew. But breakfast came first. The mess hall looked different in daylight. Sunlight streamed through the open shutters, catching the dust in golden beams. The smell of coffee hung heavy in the air. As Greta walked in, she noticed something that startled her. The soldiers were eating the same food. Same trays, same portions. For a moment, she froze in the doorway, staring. It was the opposite of every hierarchy she'd ever known. No separation, no declaration of superiority. Just people, uniformed or not, eating quietly, side by side, under the same roof. She sat down at the end of a long table. No one spoke. The clinking of forks and spoons was the only sound. Halfway through the meal, a young American approached the table carrying a pot of coffee. He stopped in front of her and gestured. "Refill?" She didn't understand the word, but she caught the tone. He wanted to pour her more. Greta hesitated, then nodded once. The boy smiled, an awkward, quick smile, and filled her cup before moving on. That small moment lingered longer than it should have. It wasn't the coffee or the warmth of it in her hands. It was the simple fact that someone who should have hated her had chosen not to. After breakfast, the prisoners were divided into small groups for orientation. Greta's group was led by a man named Sergeant Collins, a middle-aged soldier with kind eyes and a Louisiana drawl so thick it took her a moment to understand his English. "No harm, no tricks," he told them through the interpreter. "You work, you rest, you eat. Simple." He pointed toward the perimeter. "No fences you can't see, but don't test it. We don't want trouble." There was no menace in his tone, only fatigue. He looked like a man who had seen too much of war and wanted only to get through the day. As the group dispersed, Greta watched him walk away and wondered, what did he see when he looked at them? Enemies? Women? Ghosts? Later that afternoon, as the heat thickened, Greta was assigned to help in the camp laundry. The work was simple: washing uniforms, folding linens, hanging them on the line. The building smelled of soap and damp fabric, strangely comforting. While she worked, she caught sight of her reflection in a tin basin. Her face looked softer somehow, less guarded. The sharpness of fear had dulled into something quieter. Curiosity, maybe. Across the room, an American woman, one of the nurses from earlier, offered her a towel. "Here," she said gently, "for your hands." Their eyes met for a brief second. No words, just a nod. And in that instant, Greta realized something unsettling. She wanted to trust her. Not because she believed the Americans were saints, but because, against every instinct, she could feel something human again. That evening, as the sun began to set, the camp settled into routine. The sound of laughter drifted from somewhere near the kitchen. Someone was playing a harmonica. The tune was unfamiliar, cheerful, almost absurd in its normalcy. Greta sat on the steps of the barracks, watching the sky fade from orange to violet. She thought about home, the rubble, the hunger, the endless nights in bomb shelters. And she thought about the plate of warm food she'd eaten that morning. Kindness, she realized, was not gentle. It was devastating. It forced you to look at yourself and see everything you'd been taught to hate. It stripped away excuses. It made cruelty look small, stupid, cowardly. That was its power. And that was why it frightened her. When the lights dimmed and the guards made their final rounds, Greta returned to her bunk. Someone had placed a folded piece of paper on her pillow. It was a note, written in that same clumsy German as before. "Tomorrow, you will receive soap, towels, and food supplies. Sleep well. She sat there staring at it until her vision blurred. How could paper and ink feel heavier than iron bars? She folded the note, tucked it under her blanket, and lay down. Outside, the cicada sang again, the same endless chorus as the night before. They're breaking us, she thought, but not the way we expected. And with that, she finally drifted into sleep. The days at Camp Ruston began to blur into rhythm. Work, meals, rest, the strange quiet of captivity without cruelty. For the women, it became harder to tell what felt more dangerous, the fences that kept them in, or the kindness that slowly set them free inside. Days turned into weeks, and for the women of Camp Ruston, captivity began to take on the rhythm of a small, self-contained world, neither freedom nor punishment, but something in between. Every morning, the bugle call rose with the sun, echoing faintly through the pines. The women lined up for roll call, sleepy-eyed and quiet, the air already warm and heavy with the scent of dew and wood smoke. By 7, they were dispersed into their work details, the kitchen, the laundry, the infirmary, the vegetable gardens that surrounded the camp's perimeter. It was strange, Greta thought, how quickly the body could adapt, even in a place that wasn't meant to be home. She worked in the laundry most days, standing beside rows of other women, scrubbing uniforms and hanging them on long ropes to dry in the sunlight. The air smelled of soap and cotton, the water warm against her skin. Sometimes one of the guards would pass by and nod, not out of authority, but acknowledgement, like greeting a neighbor on a quiet street. That small gesture, once unthinkable, began to feel normal. At first, she resisted it. She told herself it was dangerous to grow comfortable, that comfort made prisoners forget who they were. But over time, her defiance softened into something else, not acceptance, but curiosity. What was this place really for? A prison that didn't feel like one? A punishment that looked suspiciously like mercy? In the evenings, the women gathered outside the barracks to talk. They spoke softly, in circles of 6 or 7, the way old friends might share secrets around a campfire. Some conversations were practical, about the weather, about the taste of the bread, about rumors that the war in Europe had ended for good. Others drifted toward memories of their families, their homes, the lives that seemed impossibly far away. A few even began to laugh again. The sound startled them the first time it happened. A burst of laughter, quick and light, cut through the evening air. And for a heartbeat, the entire camp fell silent, guards, prisoners, everyone. Then someone smiled, and the moment passed. Life inside Camp Ruston had its routines, but it also had its small freedoms. The women could write letters, though every one was censored. They could read donated books from the American Red Cross. They were given newspapers, rationed chocolate, even sewing materials. And every Sunday, the camp chapel opened its doors to all, regardless of uniform or flag. For many, it was the first time they'd heard a sermon that didn't begin with Fatherland. The chaplain was a tall man with a gentle Southern voice. He didn't speak about victory or vengeance. He spoke about forgiveness. War teaches us to see each other as less than human, he said one morning. But peace begins when we start seeing each other again. Greta sat in the back row, hands clasped tightly together, her throat aching. She wasn't sure if she believed him, but she wanted to. By midsummer, something unexpected had taken root in the camp. Routine had become community. There were small acts of generosity, the women sharing thread or soap, the guards leaving extra bread at the end of the line. A few Americans even began to learn German words, awkwardly mispronouncing them, to the quiet amusement of the women. Greta found herself teaching a soldier how to say Guten Morgen correctly. He laughed when he failed, and she surprised herself by laughing too. That moment, brief, fragile, felt like betrayal. Afterward, she lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering if kindness was changing her or breaking her. The camp was not paradise. There were still rules, fences, and the weight of captivity. There were still nights of homesickness so sharp it hurt to breathe. And always there was the guilt. The knowledge that back home their families were starving while they ate full meals on enemy soil. Letters from Germany came sporadically, often smudged, sometimes censored into silence. One afternoon, Greta received one from her sister, written in shaky handwriting. "The city is gone. Mama is sick. We live in the basement now. Don't worry, we still have each other." The words hit her harder than any insult could. That night, Greta pushed her dinner tray away, unable to eat. Across the table, one of the women said quietly, "We should be grateful we're alive." Greta shook her head. "Grateful feels wrong when your family has nothing." No one argued. There was nothing left to say. But even guilt couldn't stop the slow, quiet transformation happening inside the camp. One afternoon, a delivery truck arrived carrying supplies, and something unexpected: musical instruments. Within a week, someone had formed a small orchestra. On Saturdays, they played outside the mess hall: violin, accordion, clarinet. Sometimes the guards joined in, clapping along. Sometimes they danced. The first time it happened, Greta stood in the doorway of the laundry, watching as American and German, enemy and enemy, moved together to the sound of Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. For 30 minutes, she would later write, enemies danced under the Louisiana sun. The image stayed with her for the rest of her life. What grew at Camp Ruston wasn't friendship. It was something quieter, harder to name. It was mutual exhaustion, mutual recognition, a shared understanding that everyone here had been swallowed by the same war and spat out on the same patch of earth. It was strange peace. Not the peace of victory, but the peace of people too tired to hate anymore. Still, there were cracks beneath the calm. Not everyone trusted what they saw. Some women refused to speak to the guards, convinced this kindness was nothing but American propaganda. Others grew restless, haunted by the thought that every comfort here made them complicit. And Greta, who tried to stay somewhere in the middle, felt herself pulled in both directions. At night, she would reread her sister's letter, the words etched into her mind like a scar. "The city is gone." And then she'd think about the nurse's smile, or the guard offering her coffee, or the music that filled the air on Saturdays. Both realities existed at once: the ruined world behind her and the strangely merciful one around her. She didn't know which one to believe in anymore. The turning point came quietly, like most revolutions of the heart do. One afternoon, Greta saw one of the American officers reading a book during his break. Curious, she asked through the interpreter what it was. "It's about democracy," he said. "Freedom, ideas." He hesitated, then smiled. "Maybe I can find a German copy for you." And he did. A week later, a small parcel arrived, a worn German translation of the U.S. Constitution and a short booklet explaining American civic life. The officer said only, "You might find it interesting." Greta thanked him politely, though she didn't plan to read it. But that night, when the barracks fell silent, she opened the book anyway. And as her eyes moved across the first lines, about liberty, equality, and the right of the people to choose their leaders, something inside her began to tremble. Not from anger, from doubt. The kind of doubt that can change everything. The days at Camp Ruston continued, quiet on the surface, restless underneath. Kindness had opened the door, but now truth was starting to slip through. And for Greta and the others, the real battle was no longer against the Americans. It was against everything they had once believed. By late summer, the world inside Camp Ruston had grown deceptively calm. The fences were still there, the guards still watched, and yet the atmosphere felt nothing like a prison. There was laughter at mealtimes, songs in the evenings, and long, thoughtful silences that seemed to stretch between every word. But beneath that surface calm, something was beginning to stir, an unease not born of fear, but of awakening. The Americans had begun what they called educational programs. They said it was for rehabilitation, for helping the German prisoners understand democracy. To many of the women, it sounded absurd. To Greta, it sounded dangerous. She had been raised to believe that loyalty was a virtue, obedience was strength, and doubt was treason. Now, for the first time, she was being asked to think for herself. Every Thursday afternoon, the women were brought to the recreation hall for what the guards called film sessions. The building was dimly lit, the air cool, and the smell of celluloid and popcorn strange but pleasant. Rows of wooden chairs filled the room, and a projector clattered softly in the back. They watched short American documentaries, films about elections, free press, public debate. Greta didn't understand all the English, but she could feel the tone, calm, confident, hopeful. The first film showed people in suits and dresses standing in long lines outside small buildings. They weren't soldiers, they weren't shouting, they were voting. The narrator's voice was warm, steady. Every citizen has a voice. No man rules alone. The people choose. The sentence hit her like a whisper in a church. The people choose. It was such a simple phrase, and yet it felt almost blasphemous. After the film, the interpreter, a kind, middle-aged man with round glasses, asked if anyone had questions. For a long time, no one spoke. Then one woman, her accent thick from Saxony, raised her hand. And if they choose wrong, if they choose someone weak? The interpreter hesitated, then said softly, "Then they choose again." A ripple of laughter passed through the room, uneasy, half mocking, but it didn't last. Because deep down, many of them were wondering the same thing Greta was. What if everything we were taught to believe was wrong? Later that night, lying in her bunk, Greta opened the small German translation of the U.S. Constitution that the officer had given her weeks before. The paper was thin, the ink smudged, but the words were clear. We the people. She read the phrase over and over again. Not the party, not the leader, the people. The idea was both intoxicating and terrifying. She remembered the speeches she'd attended back home, the shouting, the banners, the promises of glory and purity. How easily she had believed, how proud she had felt. Now, in the quiet of the Louisiana night, she felt only shame. A few days later, a different kind of lesson arrived. The Americans held a discussion group in the mess hall, open to volunteers. Greta went, though she wasn't sure why. The topic was the future of Germany. The interpreter asked, "What do you think your country should become?" The women exchanged uneasy glances. Some said Germany should rise again. Others said it should rebuild. A few said nothing. Then Greta, surprising even herself, spoke. "Maybe we should become humble." The room went still. She didn't mean it as an insult, but the words hung in the air like something forbidden. The interpreter smiled faintly, as though recognizing something fragile being born. "Humility," he said, "that's a strong beginning." Not everyone welcomed these ideas. Some of the women muttered that the films were propaganda, that the Americans were trying to poison their minds. One, a former party secretary, refused to attend entirely. "They want to make us ashamed," she hissed, "but we did nothing wrong." Greta didn't answer. She wasn't sure what she believed anymore. But when she closed her eyes at night, she saw faces. Faces from the hospital wards back home, burned and broken, boys younger than her brother. And she couldn't stop hearing that simple, damning thought. We did nothing wrong. As summer gave way to autumn, the lessons continued. They read about women's suffrage, about civil rights, about the American idea that authority existed to serve the people, not rule them. Greta listened quietly, her heart torn between admiration and disbelief. She had been told her whole life that the German way was the superior one, the disciplined, the noble, the pure. But here she saw something humbler, yet strangely stronger. Maybe power didn't come from obedience after all. Maybe it came from conscience. One afternoon, as she worked in the laundry, Greta overheard two American officers talking outside. Their voices were low, but she caught fragments. "You know, I thought they'd be monsters," one said. "They're not. Just scared women who believed the wrong men." The words stung, and yet she couldn't deny their truth. That night, the camp was unusually quiet. A thin rain drummed softly on the roof. Greta sat at the small desk near her bunk, the Constitution open beside her, a stub of pencil in her hand. On the last page, she wrote, "If the enemy believes freedom belongs to everyone, then maybe they are not my enemy. Maybe they are what we wanted to be, before we forgot how." She tore the page from the notebook and folded it carefully, hiding it under her mattress. It wasn't rebellion, it was confession. The next morning, as she stepped outside into the pale light, something new awaited the women. A supply truck had arrived from the Red Cross, and the guards were unloading brown parcels, small and neatly wrapped. Each package bore the name of a prisoner. The women gathered, curious and whispering. The Americans said nothing, only handed them out one by one, their faces unreadable. When Greta received hers, she turned it over in her hands. Light, soft, wrapped in plain paper. She frowned, uncertain, as the interpreter announced, "These are personal hygiene items, donated for you." Inside were things she hadn't seen in years, small comforts no one ever spoke of during war. Soap, bandages, toothpaste, and something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. A packet of sanitary napkins. She stared at it, stunned. The others were silent too, holding their parcels as if they were sacred. In that moment, no one spoke, no one could, because somehow that small, practical gesture carried more weight than all the films, all the books, all the speeches combined. It wasn't just about kindness anymore. It was about dignity. And dignity had the power to destroy everything they thought they knew. The packages arrived like quiet bombs, no noise, no fire, just impact. They didn't wound the body, they pierced the conscience. And for Greta and the others, the war they thought was over was about to begin again, this time inside themselves. The parcels came on an ordinary morning, quiet, unannounced, and yet they changed everything. It was late autumn now. The air in Louisiana had turned softer, cooler, carrying the scent of wet pine and dry earth. The women of Camp Ruston lined up in the yard, expecting the usual inspection or supplies. But instead, the guards began unloading small brown boxes from the back of a Red Cross truck. Each one was wrapped neatly, labeled with a prisoner's name in careful handwriting. No speeches, no ceremony, just silent distribution. When Greta's name was called, she stepped forward and accepted the parcel, light in her hands, the paper rough against her skin. "It's a donation," the interpreter explained, "from local women's groups, personal items." Greta nodded, unsure what that meant. Back in the barracks, the women gathered on their bunks, tearing open the paper carefully, as if afraid to break the spell. Inside were simple things: bars of soap, a toothbrush, a comb, a small towel, bandages. And then, nestled at the bottom, something Greta had not seen in years: a packet of sanitary napkins. For a moment, she didn't understand what she was looking at. Then it hit her. The others noticed too. Across the room, silence spread like a wave. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. Another began to cry, soundlessly. Someone whispered, "They thought of this?" Greta held the packet in her hands, staring down at it. It was such a small thing, so practical, so ordinary, and yet it struck deeper than any act of charity she had ever known. No one in the Reich had ever spoken about this, not the officers, not the doctors, not even the nurses. During the war, women were tools, efficient, replaceable, expected to endure everything silently. But this was acknowledgement. It said, "We see you," not as soldiers, not as enemies, but as women. That night, the barracks were unusually quiet. The women didn't speak much. They sat with their packages in their laps, turning each object over as if trying to understand it. Some couldn't bear it. They hid their parcels away, ashamed of how much they wanted what was inside. Others wept openly, overwhelmed by something they couldn't name. Greta sat on her bunk, the brown paper still folded neatly beside her. She couldn't bring herself to use anything in it. It felt too intimate, too sacred. She thought about her mother, about her sister, about the women back home who had nothing, who would bleed and suffer and still have to work, starve, and pretend it didn't matter. And here she was, the enemy, being given comfort by the very people her country had tried to destroy. She whispered into the dark, "Why would they do this?" No one answered. Later that night, she opened her notebook and began to write, words that came haltingly at first, then in a rush. If the enemy values our dignity more than we ever did, then what does that make us? They could have humiliated us. They didn't. They could have treated us like beasts. They didn't. They gave us what we had been taught to despise, mercy. She stopped, staring at the page. The word mercy frightened her more than any weapon. In the days that followed, the parcels became the quiet talk of the camp. No one from the American side mentioned them again. The guards acted as though nothing unusual had happened. But for the women, the world had shifted. There was no lecture, no sermon, no film that could have done what that gesture had done. It dismantled something fundamental inside them, the certainty that they were hated, that they were less than human. Because the enemy had seen their humanity before they had seen it themselves. One afternoon, Greta noticed one of the younger prisoners, Liesel, sitting alone behind the laundry building. Her eyes were red, her package still unopened. Greta sat down beside her. "You haven't used it?" Liesel shook her head. "I can't. It doesn't feel right." Greta nodded slowly. "No, it doesn't." They sat in silence, the sun warm on their shoulders. After a while, Liesel whispered, "I don't understand them. Why help us?" Greta thought for a long time before replying. "Maybe because they can." Liesel frowned. "But what do they get from it?" Greta's voice was quiet. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe kindness isn't about getting anything." The words sounded strange to her own ears, like a language she was still learning. That evening, during roll call, Greta noticed something subtle. The guards were gentler than usual. They didn't bark orders. They called names softly, checked off lists. One of them, Sergeant Collins, the same man who had first spoken to her months ago, caught her eye. For a moment, their gazes met. He nodded, just once, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't pity, it wasn't forgiveness, it was understanding. And somehow, that was enough to undo her completely. She felt her throat tighten, her chest ache. Because understanding, she realized, was a heavier burden than hate. That night, long after lights out, Greta couldn't sleep. The room was filled with the soft breathing of exhausted women, the rustle of sheets, the distant hum of cicadas outside. She reached under her mattress and took out her notebook again. "Kindness," she wrote, "is not soft. It cuts deeper than cruelty. Cruelty you can resist, you can harden your heart and survive it. But kindness forces you to feel again. And feeling is what we've all been trying to escape." She closed the notebook, pressing it against her chest. In the days that followed, a strange quiet hung over Camp Ruston. The laughter from the evenings faded. Conversations grew shorter. Not because the women were afraid, but because they were thinking. Kindness had done what bombs and bullets never could. It had made them question everything. Their leaders had told them they were superior, righteous, chosen. But here, among the people they were taught to despise, they had found grace. And grace, once seen, cannot unseen. Weeks later, when Greta finally did use one of the items from the package, she did it slowly, deliberately. She unwrapped the soap, breathed in its faint lavender scent, and washed her hands. The water ran clear, And for a moment she thought of baptism. Not the religious kind, but something quieter, deeper. It was as if she were washing away years of blindness. She looked up into the mirror above the sink and saw herself, really saw herself for the first time in years. Tired eyes, thin face, but still human. That night, during dinner, someone made a quiet joke. A ripple of laughter followed. It was small, shy, but it carried something new, something lighter. They were still prisoners. The war still hung over them like a shadow. But inside, something had shifted. They no longer saw themselves as victims of defeat. They were beginning to see themselves as survivors of illusion. And that was a kind of freedom the fences couldn't contain. Winter would come soon, and with it, new orders. The women of Camp Ruston would soon be sent back across the ocean, to a homeland in ruins, to families they no longer recognized, to a country that had lost its soul. But Greta would carry something with her that no one could take away. The unbearable truth that sometimes kindness hurts more than cruelty, because it forces you to change. The orders came in late winter. Simple, typed pages posted to the mess hall board. All remaining prisoners will be repatriated to Germany within 2 weeks. No one cheered. No one smiled. The news that should have brought relief instead settled like a stone in their chests. They had dreamed of going home for months. They had counted the days, the hours. But now, faced with the reality of it, many felt something unexpected: fear. Home wasn't the same place they had left, and neither were they. The morning of departure was gray, the Louisiana air cool and damp. Trucks lined the yard once more, just as they had on the day the women arrived. But this time, the atmosphere was different. No trembling hands, no whispered prayers. Only a quiet heaviness, like the air before rain. Greta packed her few belongings: a towel, a bar of soap, the small notebook she had written in since her first night. At the bottom of the bag, she tucked away the last scrap of wrapping paper from the Red Cross parcel. It wasn't much, but it reminded her of the moment she had first understood what kindness could do. When her name was called, she climbed onto the truck without looking back. The guard at the gate, Sergeant Collins, gave her a small nod, the same silent gesture he had offered so many times before. She nodded back. No words were exchanged. There was nothing left to say. The journey north felt longer than the one that had brought them there. Weeks on ships and trains, through landscapes scarred by war and winter. The women spoke little, lost in thought. When they finally reached Europe, the contrast was almost unbearable. America had been green, ordered, alive. Germany was gray, broken, quiet, in the way only ruins can be. At the port, American officers handed the women over to British and French officials who processed them and directed them toward refugee stations. Greta stood on the dock, staring at the skyline, or what was left of it. Smoke still drifted from the skeletons of buildings. The air smelled of ash, coal, and decay. She whispered to herself, "This is home." But it didn't feel like home at all. When she reached Hamburg weeks later, she found her neighborhood unrecognizable. The street where her family had lived was half rubble, half weeds. Windows shattered, walls collapsed, entire buildings gone. Her childhood home had vanished. In its place stood a blackened foundation and a single crooked doorway that opened onto nothing. A neighbor, an old woman with soot-stained fingers, recognized her and took her in. Over tea brewed from dried herbs, she told Greta what had happened. "Your mother died last winter. Fever, we think. Your sister lives in the basement of the old post office. She helps dig through the rubble for food." The words didn't seem real. Greta nodded, thanked her, and walked through the ruins until she found the place. Her sister, Marta, was thinner than she remembered, pale, hollow-eyed, her hands rough and cracked. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then, Marta whispered, her voice breaking. "They didn't hurt you?" Greta shook her head slowly. "No," she said softly. "They fed us." The reunion should have been joyous, but instead it felt haunted. Marta couldn't understand it. How could the enemy, those who had bombed their cities, have shown kindness? Greta tried to explain, fumbling for words that never seemed enough. She spoke of the camp, of the food, of the music, of the way the Americans had treated them not as prisoners, but as people. But to Marta, starving and surrounded by ruins, those words sounded like betrayal. "You sound like them," she said bitterly, "like you've forgotten what they did to us." Greta didn't argue, because part of her understood. Kindness had opened her eyes, but it had also separated her from everyone who hadn't seen what she had. It was a quiet exile, more painful than any cell. In the weeks that followed, Greta tried to rebuild some semblance of life. She found work at a makeshift clinic tending to children who had survived the bombings. She mended clothes, boiled water, carried supplies through the snow. At night, she wrote in her notebook, small, private reflections no one would ever read. "We were wrong," she wrote. "Not just because we lost, but because we forgot what being human meant. And now we must learn again." She tried to tell her story once, to a man at the ration line who had served in the Wehrmacht. When she mentioned that the Americans had been kind, he spat on the ground. "You were brainwashed," he said. "They fooled you." She didn't respond. Because maybe, in a way, he was right. Maybe she had been fooled. Fooled by decency. Fooled by compassion. Fooled by a version of humanity she'd been told didn't exist. But if that was foolishness, it was one she chose to keep. Winter deepened. Snow covered the ruins, softening the edges of broken walls. One morning, Greta found a letter slipped under the clinic door. It was from the American Red Cross, a brief typed message. "Thank you for your service during captivity. May this small token remind you that peace is built, not found." Inside was a bar of chocolate, the same brand they had been given that first night in Camp Ruston. Greta held it for a long time before unwrapping it. She broke off a small piece, let it melt on her tongue. The sweetness hurt. It brought back everything: the faces, the laughter, the unbearable kindness that had undone her. She smiled through tears. "Even now," she whispered, "they're still teaching me." Months later, Greta traveled to a refugee center near Bremen to help distribute aid. There, she met an American officer who had once served at Camp Ruston. He recognized her instantly. "Greta Mueller," he said, surprised. "You made it back." She nodded. "Yes, though sometimes I wonder if part of me stayed there." He smiled gently. "Maybe that's not a bad thing." For a moment, neither spoke. Then he reached into his coat and handed her a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, taken at the camp. Dozens of women, standing in sunlight, some smiling faintly, some looking away. In the corner, Greta could see herself, thin, serious, alive. "We kept this," he said, "to remember what peace looked like." She traced the edges of the photo with trembling fingers. "Peace," she murmured. "Yes. Though it didn't feel like peace then. It felt like breaking." He nodded. "That's how peace usually starts." That night, in her journal, Greta wrote her final entry about Camp Ruston. "They broke us, yes, but not with cruelty. They broke us with kindness, with patience, with the unbearable act of seeing us as human again. And maybe that's what salvation really is. Not a miracle, but a slow, painful remembering of what it means to care." She closed the notebook and stared into the firelight. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet forgiveness. Years later, when asked by her granddaughter what the war had taught her, Greta didn't speak of battles or politics or leaders. She said only this: "The hardest thing about being treated with kindness by your enemy is that it forces you to see yourself clearly. and sometimes that truth is harder to live with than hate. Greta's story didn't end with her return home. It echoed across generations. Because kindness, once given, doesn't die with the giver. It ripples outward, shaping lives long after the war has faded into history. And in the quiet years that followed, her small story from a forgotten camp would become something larger, a testament to how humanity survives even its darkest hour. Time, as it always does, moved on. The war that had once defined Greta's world became a story, then a memory, then a line in a history book. But for Greta, and for the women of Camp Ruston, it never truly ended. Because some lessons don't fade when the shooting stops. Some linger quietly, like an echo that refuses to die. Years later, in the stillness of her small apartment in post-war Hamburg, Greta would sometimes take out the notebook she'd kept from those days. The cover was faded, the pages brittle, but the words still carried life. Kindness is the hardest truth, one page read. It demands that we see ourselves not as victims or heroes, but as humans, flawed, frightened, and still capable of grace. She often reread those lines when the city outside felt too gray, too broken. Because in a world rebuilding itself from ashes, she had come to understand something few ever did. That real healing doesn't begin with justice or victory. It begins when someone dares to be kind, when it's least deserved. In the 1950s, Greta worked as a nurse again, this time at a small hospital for displaced families. She rarely spoke of the war. When people asked where she had been during those years, she would only say, "In America, learning how to be human again." Her colleagues assumed she was joking. She never corrected them. But sometimes, when she treated a frightened child or an injured stranger, she would remember the faces of the American nurses at Camp Ruston. The gentle hands, the soft English words she hadn't understood then, but felt all the same. "You are okay. A little thin, but okay. We feed you good here." Even after decades, those words could still bring tears to her eyes. In her later years, Greta began writing letters to her granddaughter, Anna, a young girl who loved history and asked endless questions about the war. Greta tried to answer honestly, though not always with details. Instead, she wrote about feelings, about guilt, about mercy, about the strange, beautiful power of being forgiven by someone you once feared. "We were taught that strength means never bending," she wrote in one letter. "But kindness taught me that true strength is bending and still standing." Those letters would later be published in a small collection, Letters from Camp Ruston, printed privately by Anna decades after Greta's death. It never became famous, but for those who read it, it left an impression that outlasted any monument. Today, there is almost nothing left of Camp Ruston. The barracks have collapsed, the fences rusted away. Pine trees have reclaimed the land, their roots curling through what once were foundations. But if you walk there in the quiet of late afternoon, you might still find traces: an old concrete step, a nail half buried in the soil, a piece of wood with faded German handwriting on it. And sometimes, visitors say, when the wind moves through the trees, it sounds almost like distant laughter. The laughter of women who had learned, against all odds, that kindness can survive even in captivity. Greta never saw America again, but she carried it with her: the smell of pine and soap, the sound of cicadas, the taste of warm bread. She carried the faces of strangers who had treated her with dignity when her own nation had forgotten what that meant. And in that carrying, she passed something on, not to nations, but to people. Because kindness, once given, doesn't die. It travels quietly from hand to hand, heart to heart, long after the moment itself is gone. When Greta passed away in 1989, her granddaughter found the notebook beside her bed. Inside, on the final page, she had written, "They could have humiliated us, but they didn't. They gave us soap and food and dignity, and that was the hardest thing to bear, because it made us see who we really were." Those words, now framed in a museum in Hamburg, stand as one woman's testament to a truth bigger than any war. Not that mercy excuses what was done, but that mercy reminds us what we're still capable of, even after we've lost everything else. In the end, Greta's life wasn't about being a prisoner or a survivor. It was about transformation, the quiet, painful kind that begins not with punishment, but with compassion. Her story reminds us that kindness is not weakness. It is the rarest kind of courage. The kind that asks us not to fight harder, but to love harder. If stories like this remind you that humanity can outlast even the darkest moments of history, help us keep them alive. Hit the like button, share this story, and subscribe for more hidden truths from the past, stories of mercy, resilience, and hope. Because somewhere out there, another Greta is still learning that kindness can change the world, and maybe, together, we can make sure it never fades again.